Welcome to a presentation on the Sauk County Court House clock tower restoration. This is a presentation by the Sauk County Historical Society. The clock tower on the top of the courthouse has been the centerpiece of Baraboo and the timepiece in downtown Baraboo for over 109 years. It sits on the center of the courthouse, in the center of the square, in the center of Baraboo. But how did it get here? It's a story that begins more than 180 years earlier. The story begins with the creation of Sauk County in 1840 on land that belonged to the Ho-Chunk people. The Treaty of 1837, which a handful of Ho-Chunk were coerced into signing, ceded all of their lands east of the Mississippi. In 1840, Sauk County was laid out geographically, but it would be 4 more years before a county government was established. The first order of business in setting up Sauk County government was to establish a county seat. 3 commissioners were selected by the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature to come to the area and decide where the county seat should be. They decided that it would be a contest between Prairie du Sac and its neighboring village, Haratsi, later Sauk City, to see which of the 2 villages could offer the most in way of free lots to the county government. And although Haratsi donated or proposed to donate a building as well as free lots to the county, it was Prairie du Sac that won the day, and Prairie du Sac was decided as the first county seat of Sauk County. So the first courthouse was built in Prairie du Sac on a block of land. It was a wooden 2-story building, which would have been temporary. And Prairie du Sac would have remained the courthouse, except for a little tiff that had started with the selection process. It was discovered that the offer of the free lots to the county from Prairie du Sac were contingent, and that if the county seat ever moved, those lots would revert back to their original owners. This made a lot of other people mad, as well as the sore losers in Sauk City and even in the Baraboo Valley. And a referendum was then called for in 1846, in which it was decided to move the county seat to the Baraboo Valley. So the Sauk County government selected a portion of land just north of the Baraboo River, where there was an oak savanna, and platted a village named Adams. Adams was platted around a public square, and a courthouse was built on the north side of the square, leaving the central public square devoid of buildings until a more permanent brick courthouse could be built. So the second courthouse for Sauk County was another 2-story wooden building built on the north side of the square in Baraboo, which was originally Adams, and this was about where the Square Tavern is today on 4th Avenue. Several years later, construction started on a new brick courthouse in the middle of the square in 1855. It took a few years to build because there was no railroad to Baraboo at the time, so all the bricks had to be made locally, several 100,000 bricks. Wood also had to be cut and dried locally. So the new brick courthouse was not finished until 1857. This is the earliest known picture of the square, looking from the corner of 3rd and Oak northwest across the square, and we see the new brick courthouse in the middle of the square with a cupola hiding behind some trees. The 1850s courthouse was added on to in 1884. By the turn of the 20th century, however, it was in need of being replaced. It took years for the county board to decide to authorize $100,000 to replace it. A vote was successful in November of 1904. The next month, in December of 1904, the old brick courthouse took revenge on the authorization to replace it by starting itself on fire and being destroyed. Ironically, all of the county documents were safe in various vaults and chambers, but the authorization to replace this building was still out on the county clerk's desk and was destroyed in that fire. A design contest was then held, and several firms from Wisconsin submitted plans for the new Sauk County Courthouse. The winners were Ferry and Kloss of Milwaukee, were chosen to be the architects. This was perhaps a local favorite, as Alfred Kloss of the firm was born in Sauk City and had worked on other local places in Baraboo, such as the Charles Ringling House and the Van Orden Mansion. So Ferry and Kloss did design the new courthouse. It was a rather modest building for those days. It did include a cupola on top that could contain a clock. However, the note on the blueprint says, "Note, clock and dials not included in this contract." So construction began in 1905 and was completed in 1906 on the new courthouse, this time built of brick, steel, concrete, and faced with stone, and including a small cupola on top. The inside was fully modern with gas and electric lighting, steam heating, ventilation, and even telephones. But the cupola on the top of the courthouse did wait for a clock to be added to it when money would allow. Here's a rare colorized postcard of the courthouse showing an indication of the green terracotta tile roof and the original copper cladding on the cupola. We want to switch gears for a moment here and talk about this gentleman. His name is John Jacob Gadeker, and he was born in Switzerland in 1836. He was highly educated. He taught French, Italian, and mathematics for 10 years before becoming a private tutor in Italy. And then in 1855, when he was 29, he came to Sauk County as part of the growing Swiss population here. He became county clerk in 1858 and held that position for 8 years. And while he was in Baraboo, he started a hardware business with his brother Alfred Gadeker. The Gadeker brothers also went on to build two double-story, two-store blocks in downtown Baraboo, so they became quite wealthy in the real estate business. In 1871, John J. Gadeker had this house built for him and his family on 7th Street. The house is still there today, and this is where John J. Gadeker died in 1895. He had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters, and his 2 daughters, Louise and Margaret, also known as Gritley, continued to live in the house, the daughters that is. They never married and died here in 1925 and 1946 respectively. In 1915, Louise and Gritley Gadeker decided to honor their late father by donating the money to pay for not only the clock that the courthouse was missing, but also to pay for 2 bells to make it a chiming clock. Architect Alfred Kloss was called back to design an addition to the courthouse cupola to allow for the clocks as well as the 2 bells. So the original cupola was heightened in order to put the bells in the bottom and provide for 4 clock faces much larger than originally planned above. In early 1915, an order was placed for a tower clock from the Seth Thomas Company of Connecticut. The model that was ordered was number 16, which would be hefty enough for the 4 clock faces as well as the 2 bells. The clock and bells would be run by weights, but the weights were automatically wound by electricity daily. There was only one other tower clock like this in Wisconsin when it was installed, and that one was in Green Bay. The plaque on the clock mechanism shows that it was the 1931st tower clock that the Seth Thomas Company made. They made approximately 3,500 tower clocks in total, and this one was finished on April 21st, 1915, and then shipped to Baraboo. The clock mechanism would be placed in the attic of the courthouse, and then a motion assembly would transfer the clock movement to the bells and also to the four faces over 25 feet above the clock mechanism. The clock faces are 6 feet 6 inches in diameter. Another plaque on the clock mechanism honors J.J. Gattaker and states where he was born and when he died, and also that it was given by Gritly and Louise Gattaker. The picture on the right is a rare photo of one of the bells being lifted to the courthouse roof in May of 1915. The largest of the two bells is 46 inches in diameter and weighs 2,000 pounds. It strikes on the hour and has the note of E. The smaller bell is 30 inches across, weighs 600 pounds, and strikes the half hour on the note of B. Both bells were cast with raised letters honoring the memory of J.J. Gattaker. On the other side are the foundry marks, and it indicates that it was made by the McShane Bell Foundry in Baltimore, Maryland. The clock tower, which was originally sheathed in copper, was extended up and finished in May of 1915. Also being constructed at the same time was the Al Ringling Theater, and this is a photo of the theater as it stood on June 24th, 1915, which was Al Ringling Appreciation Day in downtown Baraboo. So on that day, several thousand people gathered on the square underneath the new clock tower, which unfortunately is not visible in this photograph, to thank Al Ringling for his gift of the theater in case he passed away before it was finished. One of the first major trials for the clock tower was the great ice storm of 2/22/22, so February 22nd, 1922, when much of the lower part of Wisconsin was covered in a devastating ice storm which broke many trees. And it was noted in the newspaper that the clock hands froze up, but the clock was repaired and restored to working order. Now, at some point, the clock tower started being painted white, covering the original copper. This was perhaps due to seams that were opening up, and it was easier just to caulk them and paint the whole clock tower. And the clock ran until about 2014 before it seized up and stopped operating. To get to the clock tower, one must go to the fourth floor of the Sauk County Court House and climb these stairs up to the attic of the building. Once in the attic, you come across a small wooden room that was created just to house the clock mechanism. And this room was made with parts of the crate that the clock came in 1915. And this beautiful piece of craftsmanship sits in this little wooden room in the attic of the courthouse, with a small clock on the face to indicate what time is showing on the clock hands above. Now, in the fall of 2020, after several years of the clock not working, an investigation was made to see if the clock could be made operational again. And Bill Johnson of Baraboo was instrumental in getting this endeavor started, along with Ian Crammon, the facilities director for Sauk County. And they got Jay Palmer of Palmer Manufacturing to come and take a look at the clock. A few things were tweaked and it was restored to working condition, but it lasted for only a few days. There were too many other monumental problems. And even when it was running, all four clock faces were never quite the same time, and the time was always a little off. So later in 2020, restoration was authorized, and this was led by Ian Crammond, Sauk County Facilities Director. And thanks to Bill Johnson, Phil Wright of the Tower Clock Restoration Company out of South Charleston, Ohio, was located. Phil has been working on tower clocks for over 40 years, has restored more than 100 of them, worked on hundreds more, so he was definitely qualified to fix the Sauk County clock. So Phil dismantled the clock mechanism from the courthouse attic, took it to Ohio, and overhauled it before it was brought back to Baraboo in early 2022. At that time, instead of putting it into storage, it was decided to display it at the Sauk County History Center. So for over a year, the clock mechanism was placed on display and running at the Sauk County History Center, while the clock tower itself waited restoration. At the History Center, people could get an up-close look at the wonderful mechanism that has been hidden away in the courthouse attic. The tower restoration was started in 2023, and it was an obstacle even to get to it because of the tile roof that surrounds the clock tower. This couldn't just be walked on or have scaffolding set on top of it. Bachman Construction of Madison was awarded the contract to restore the clock tower, and they cleverly removed enough tiles to allow for the scaffolding to be set up around the entire clock tower. After the scaffolding was completed, Phil Wright came back to Baraboo to remove the clock faces. Until the clock faces were removed, the only way to get up into the clock tower itself was to go back into the attic and crawl up a stairs above the clock mechanism room, which would lead to the first level where the bells were housed. From the bell room, another original wooden ladder leads up to a hatch to take a person into the clock face room itself. Phil Wright removed the original clock hands from the clock faces and then worked on removing the glass and cast iron clock faces themselves. This was quite a job due to the corrosion of the cast metal clock faces and the delicate nature of the original glass. Each clock face is made up of 6 segmental pieces of cast iron. All of the original glass was able to be retained, and this is vitrolite glass, which turns a purplish pink color after many years of exposure to UV light. Rotten wood was also repaired by Bachman Construction. This included making new circles of framing for each of the 4 clock faces. Next up was to strip the paint off of the original metal cladding on the clock tower itself. During this process, it was discovered that the clock tower was still originally sheathed in solid copper. So as workers continued to remove the paint off of the clock tower, it was decided that rather than repaint it, the original copper would be restored. After the stripping was complete, all of the copper was then exposed and started to oxidize immediately. The intended effect, ever since 1905 with the original cupola and 1915 with the expanded clock tower, was that the copper would eventually oxidize into a green patina, much like the Statue of Liberty. This began immediately as the copper was exposed to the air and rainwater. The original seams from 1915 also needed to be addressed on the copper, and fortunately a firm in Madison was available with the expertise to redo many of the original copper seams. This was a skilled process that involved heat soldering many of the seams that were on the horizontal surfaces. So with the copper stripped and the seams sealed, the exterior of the clock tower was nearing completion. In July, Phil Wright returned from Ohio with the restored clock faces, which were painted in their original black and white color scheme and then installed. Glass was put in with the original brass clips as well as modern caulking. Interior steel was also painted. The red triangular shaped structure in the middle of the clock room is actually the original roof framing of the shorter cupola from 1905. Phil Wright also crafted new clock hands for all four faces. The originals and the new hands are all made of sugar pine, which is a very lightweight wood, which was counterbalanced with brass rods so that each clock hand is perfectly balanced. With the clock hands reinstalled, the clocks were now ready to start working again. The mechanism was removed from the Sauk County History Center and relocated back to the clock room in the attic of the Sauk County Court House. The movement from the clock mechanism comes off the top of the unit up about 25 feet through the use of a rod and universal joint system. There are several slight bends in its travel up to the clock faces, including up a wooden chute that was constructed in 1915. At the top, this rod is then distributed to all four clock faces with this universal joint, which was restored by Phil Wright. From the center of the clock tower room, the movement is distributed to all four clock faces, and then the minute hands and hour hands are run with the gearing system behind each of the clock faces. The clock tower began running again in early September of 2023, and on September 14th, 2023, the bells once again started ringing at a formal dedication ceremony that evening. A big thank you to Sauk County government for its commitment to the restoration of the clock and the clock tower. Thank you to Ian Crammon, Sauk County Facilities Director, for his oversight and allowing access to the whole project for pictures. Thank you to Bill Johnson for drone shots and conventional photography, as well as to Seth Taft and Phil Wright for photos as well. Thank you to Phil Wright of the Tower Clock Restoration Company for his expertise on restoring the clock. Thank you to Bachman Construction for their expertise on restoring the clock tower. And thank you to Madison Sheet Metal for their expertise on restoring the copper seams. We'd also like to thank Action Electric for their work on the electrical components and lighting in the clock tower. Thank you for joining us on this presentation on the Sauk County Courthouse clock tower restoration. The Sauk County Historical Society was established in 1905, and its first museum was actually in the basement of the Sauk County Courthouse. It was still there in 1915 when the clock was added to the building. We are, of course, still here today with a different building and a different museum, as well as the Sauk County History Center. We encourage you to find out more at saukcountyhistory.org. We also encourage you to join the Sauk County Historical Society and help us in our mission to collect, preserve, and share Sauk County history. You can do that at our website or by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you so much.